Oh, isn't this fun? Hello, everybody. Familiar faces. I feel like Mr. Rogers waving to Emma Steinhobel, waving to everybody. Jan, Kim, Nancy Collins, some of our cooperative members. Steve Thomas is here. Eric Heyman is here. Yes, look at this. Thank you so much for joining us. Have some people rolling in their graduations and vaccinations and all kinds of things going on in the world. So we are going to add people as we have them. And one of our actual speakers may be a little late, but we have two of the three, and I'm delighted to introduce them. First of all, let me introduce myself and my producer, Betsy Vardell, who's in the top left corner, who makes all this possible. I'm Jessica Helfand, one of the founders of Design Observer. And one of the things that we have been doing during the pandemic, which I realize is marvelously coming to an end, is hosting these monthly events that we do at lunchtime so that people can join from Europe and people can join from the West Coast. Eric's on the West Coast having his cup of coffee in the morning. Some of us are having lunch. Feel free to eat while you're listening. And really because we missed each other, but also because we really missed seeing each other's work. So it's part show and tell, part conversation. Please put your whereabouts in the chat and say hello. Put your questions in the chat and say hello. I want to begin by I'm going to introduce Ellen Lupton and let her introduce her guests who are editors with her of this wonderful new book that came out last week from Princeton Architectural Press. And I just want to say about my favorite Ellen, of many Ellens, and I have many Ellens in my life. I have a co-host podcast named Ellen, another favorite Ellen, but this Ellen invites me in normal times to come to MICA, where she is the chair of design, to talk to her students. And it is a really high point of my year to go down to Baltimore and see Abbott and Ellen and all the students. And last time I was there, which was pre-pandemic, I asked Ellen what she was working on, and she said, I have this idea for a book. And she described the book, and she told me what she wanted to call the book. And that book is this book. So to me, it was just a glimmer in her eye. And now here it is, this fully fledged, beautiful collaborative effort of many authors, of which we have a few here today. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the one and only Ellen Lupton to discuss this wonderful project, how it came about, what's going on with all of you. And I'm so glad we have the multiple voices to share their various pieces of this exquisite volume. Over to you, Ellen.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I love being with you always. And today, my amazing co-author, Kaleena Sales, is here. And Josh Halstead might also be joining us. And we're excited to share some of the ideas in the book and some of the process and just some of how we got to the thinking that we're in now. So Kaleena is a professor of graphic design at Tennessee State University, where she is currently the interim chair. And it has been such a pleasure to learn from her over the last 2 years. And she's also a leading member of the AIGA Design Educators Committee, and she's going to talk about some of the amazing work she's doing there. And Josh is also a design educator. He is a disabilities design advocate and designer and writer and an incredible collaborator on this project as well. So I'm going to grab the screen and start our conversation. This is our book, and it has 7 co-authors, which has been a fascinating process of broadening the voices and broadening the experience of the book. And so I always love being with these co-authors and talking about our project together. The book is very visual. It has a section on theory, a section on history, and a section on work. And the idea is to talk about some of the principles of equity, social justice, feminism, disability rights, as they relate to graphic design, as it is practiced in the world, and to the history of our profession. The book is filled with stuff. It is part comic book, part manifesto, part user guide. it is, get to Josh in a minute. It is a beginning, like an almanac of our time. And it is a beginning towards thinking about the profession that we want to make, how we want to grow and change graphic design. So Kaleena, I'm going to ask you a question about equity and equality, which is one of your essays in the book. And in particular, you talk about your concerns as an educator. And it's been an unusual time, in 2020 and 2021, where equity has presented itself as a different kind of challenge, new challenges. So thanks for telling us about that.
Yeah, thank you. So I teach design at Tennessee State University, which is an HBCU. HBCU is a historically Black college or university. And so the majority of my students are Black students learning design, and a large majority of my students are actually first generation college students. And so what's really interesting is that, our computer lab on campus sort of serves as this like equalizer in the sense that it offers access to everyone. But when the pandemic pushed us all virtual, suddenly, it was really obvious where there were issues surrounding lack of access. And so there were students who did not have resources to have, their own laptop or software. And it made it really difficult for them to figure out how they were going to just finish their assignments. And so what I think is sort of kind of eye-opening about that experience is that it really points to this bigger discussion on lack of or underrepresentation of Black and minorities in design in general. And I think there's so many different variables that contribute to that underrepresentation, but I would say that certainly one of those is can be pointed back to maybe just lack of access. And so in the book, there's a section that talks about the difference really between equality and equity. And it's illustrated beautifully here by Jennifer Tobias. But, really the large point that we're hoping to make is that, the focus should really be more on equity because it really serves the individual needs as opposed to just sort of offering a solution for everyone. And it really just acknowledges that we're all coming to this from different starting points. And so we might need different resources or help to kind of further us along in the industry. So that's what that section is about in the book, and sort of kind of reflects on my experience in teaching design at TSU.
And Kaleena, have you seen at TSU that there's been a decline in enrollments because of this issue during the pandemic?
Yeah, so the numbers went way down this past year in terms of students that were just studying design. And for a while, we were wrapping our heads around what happened. And we realized that what happened was the students who could not have access to classes just didn't re-enroll. And so we're hoping that when we go back in person in the fall, there's an uptick, in numbers, and that sort of we kind of, are coming out of this, and people are starting to be able to get back on track, with their education.
Well, that's a really upsetting demographic, right? Data point there, that the pandemic could have this lasting effect on the profession and on building a more diverse profession because of this gap in access.
Yeah, and another thing that's sort of to that point, though, a lot of the students that didn't come back are working just to sort of support family, or they're back at homes, and so maybe if they are a first generation college student, their family may not really understand, that they need to be studying. And so, they're taking on jobs and other responsibilities. And so that's another part of it as well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So this idea of equity, we applied that idea in another section of the book about confidence equity, which is a term that we made up, like inspired by this conversation. And we examined the idea of confidence, which is often seen as a kind of muscle that everyone should develop, and that you can just build your confidence, and that there's an equality, right? An equality of everybody being dealt the same hand. And yet confidence is not just something that, that comes from us internally. It's actually something invested in us by others in society. So if we think of an airline pilot, people are investing confidence in her and her authority, and she's projecting confidence through her voice, through her body language, through her uniform, right? These social signifiers, which also make her feel that she embodies that confidence. And the problem, when we talk about a confidence gap or confidence equity problems, is that some people are raised to feel confident and are always treated as if they deserve to be confident. And so in the book, we talk about the need to share your confidence with others. If you are in a position of privilege and you feel entitled to be confident, that you need to help other people build their confidence. And the main way we do that is actually by investing that confidence in others, expressing our trust, expressing our belief in people's ability to do a job or to perform in a certain way. And so, a related term is imposter syndrome, which is clearly some pop psychology invention, which sort of puts the burden of feeling like an imposter on the person having that sensation, right? It medicalizes what is actually a social issue, of people being doubted and second guessed and questioned. Why are you here? Are you deserving? Do you really have the goods? And often we actually are getting those messages from others and giving those messages, right? Sending those messages. So in the book, we had I'm going to show you a little bit of the backstory of this illustration from the book, which is built on my experience as an educator. And I'm sure Kaleena has experienced this too, where sometimes there's that one person in the room who is the most confident and always has something to say and always has an opinion and kind of uses up the airspace of everybody else. And so we wanted to create what Jennifer Tobias, the amazing illustrator and co-author, started developing this illustration of this student who's bigger than everyone else. And we made him a male student because often that's the case. In my classrooms, men tend to be the minority in graduate and undergraduate graphic design courses, and yet they're often the most confident and feel the most excited to speak and share their ideas. But as Jenny and I developed this illustration, we got uncomfortable with identifying it as a man and decided to make it more universal. And it's an elephant. And you can put in yourself who this character is if you have met them in some situation. So that's a little bit about that topic. Here's another illustration that we developed and changed. And this is an illustration about interns. And we depicted the intern as this many-armed goddess who does all the Photoshop tools and all the physical labor in the office. We put a lot of time into this illustration and then kind of pulled back and suddenly felt uncomfortable about it, that it was referencing a religious tradition, a cultural tradition that is not mine to represent. And interestingly, when we worked with Tanvi Sharma, who's a wonderful designer and critic from India, she researched feminist graphic design in India and identified this amazing poster, which uses that image of the many-armed goddess in a poster about domestic violence. And it's so much better to have this metaphor played out here in this context, in this authentic illustration from that culture than in the drawing that we had done originally. So part of the book is about history and how to create history. And we just touch on little bits of history in order to invite the reader to create their own, that readers, designers, all of you at Design Observer are building history. And so by telling stories like the story of Angel Decorah, an incredible Native American designer working at the turn of the century, we can indicate some of the missing pages in our books, right? Some of the stories that we can tell, but that others need to tell too. And so Kaleena, you have some wonderful language for talking about that, and you're doing a lot with that in your classroom with broadening history. So tell us about how design plays such a important and disturbing role in systemic racism, and what we as educators and designers need, how we need to act to change that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we all know that, much of what has really informed graphic design education comes from the Western world. So there's a lot of emphasis on, Bauhaus or international typographic style. And as great as sort of those contributions are, the narrowed lens really perpetuates this narrative that only good design can come from certain places. And I think more troubling is sort of the parallel narrative that suggests that other parts of the world or other kind of, maybe like subcultures are not contributing to design in a way that's important or worthwhile. And so, Ellen talked earlier about, that confidence equity. And so it's really interesting how that relates, because if you don't see your, culture or a group that you identify with being represented in, design or design education, you begin to sort of believe that, and you don't have your voice validated, and you begin to believe that you don't belong in the conversation. And so in this essay, I was reflecting on just learning about African Adinkra symbols when I was taking art history at Tennessee State University as an undergraduate student, and how that really blew my mind, learning that there were these beautifully designed pieces that I'd never heard about before, and that it's happening all over the world, but that we don't hear about it, when we're reading or when we're studying design. And so on the next slide, yeah, I'm really, I started to do some research for my students and for myself into, groups of people and artists and designers who have very intentionally gone against the mainstream. And so Afrocobra is one of those groups. They're a 1960s artist collective from Chicago. And they very specifically created this sort of list of principles and guidelines for their artwork that was very intentionally kind of against the mainstream. And so I love that because of the intentionality behind it. And it was with the purpose of sort of doing work for the culture that they belonged to, and they were validating the voices of their audience in doing so. And so I try to use artists like these in my classroom as an example. And this is a series, it goes by the title of Beyond the Bauhaus. And it's not really to sort of say that there's anything wrong with the Bauhaus, or to sort of deny any sort of contribution from, the Western world, but it's really to expand the conversations that we're having in the classroom to include other stories, other narratives, other voices. And so there's this great quote from an Afro-Cobra artist, Michael Harris. It says, rather than squeezing into the canon, we're saying, let's make the canon more elastic so that it includes what we do and who we are. And so these are a few examples of some of the articles that are part of this series. And I love it because they're contributions from design educators from across the country. And so I'm not writing all of the content, there's people that are contributing these really beautifully written pieces. And so, there's a piece on G's bin quilters, for example, that I adore. And it really speaks to that larger point. So I think there's work to be
That's
done.
so
And I'm
great.
trying to sort of do some of the work as best as I can, but I think that we all can contribute to expanding, this canon and contributing the parts that are missing.
This idea of the elastic canon,
Yeah,
is so great, and really really is helping me in my own teaching. And
there's the
having
title for your
all
next
my
book.
classes. Or Kalena's book.
Kalena's next book.
Yeah, the elastic canon, and it should have
Yeah.
many voices, right? Many contributors. So a lot of us are working from home, which has been a very interesting experience. And here's two images from our book of kind of the ideal home office, which is, of course, Barbie's dream house with a 3-story spiral slide and a hot tub up there next to the little suite of mid-century modern furniture with just like a delicate laptop perched there. Right? And then there's more the reality for a lot of designers is a very small apartment and doing a lot of work from your bed. And I think, Kaleena, for you, it's somewhere in between. But I'm really fascinated by your insights about what it's been like to work at home during the pandemic.
Yeah, this is my office mate. So this is my son Julian, but I like this image because it really does sort of encapsulate the experience of working from home for so many people, and being a mom, and whatever your sort of family dynamic looks like. I think one thing that we have all learned, or hope that we've learned from sort of working at home, is that we're full people, that we're not just sort of having a relationship with our work, that we're having a relationship with real people around us, and we have real responsibilities. And so I hope that that's considered when we are moving back into the office and back into school, and that we're not forgetting some of the lessons that we've learned, and even reflecting on I think the early kind of months of the pandemic, I reflected on just sort of my own privileges, and you sort of are suddenly aware of what you do have. I know that I think there was maybe in March or April of 2020, when we really could not go anywhere. I was really appreciative that we had a yard, that we had, a place to go outside, and, and I thought about my friends who were like living in New York and in studio apartments and that sort of thing, and had to work a little bit harder to have that kind of, experience. And so I hope that all of the awareness that we've learned throughout this past year, that we don't forget it, that we bring it back into the workplace with us. So.
And what about equity and Zoom and the culture of Zoom? I found in my classrooms, even though I very much miss being with my students, there's something about that grid of faces that everybody's on the same plane and I can hear everybody equally, and there's no one sitting in the back, kind of not feeling less
Yeah.
accessible to me. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, there's certainly situations where if you are, let's say, a minority in your workplace, for when I was working as an art director, I was the only Black person in the creative department. And that can be an isolating experience, and sort of not necessarily feeling like you're part of the larger group. But I think suddenly when we're at home, everyone's isolated. And so like everyone's alone, and so it sort of breaks up any sort of natural like cliques or groups and subgroups, and it does create this equitable, like, working environment. So it's interesting.
There's no water cooler.
There's no water cooler. That's right.
Very interesting. And then you're teaching specifically at an HBCU. Can you talk a little bit about how your teaching has changed over time?
Yeah. So these are some examples of some student work, and I started teaching when I was 27, so that was quite a few years ago at this point. And so I know, although I went to an HBCU and I come from a very similar background as many of my students, when you're teaching, it sort of gives you a different lens because you're recognizing patterns and things that your students are doing. And so I started to notice that my students were really interested in design that reflected their culture. And so it's, reflective of Black culture, and it's, the textures and the colors and the energy of the work speaks to that. And so early in my teaching career, I didn't know what to do with that. And I sort of wanted to make sure that my students were going to be taken seriously in the industry. And to me, that meant that they needed to retool their aesthetics in favor of a mainstream approach. And so I was teaching, flush left, sans serif, just all of the kind of rules of design, out of probably my own fear of them not being taken seriously. So now I approach it differently, and I don't believe that the onus should be on the student, to reshape who they are, but instead on the industry, again, to open ourselves up and check our biases and make sure that we're not sort of imposing these old, like, antiquated, thoughts on what good design should be on a group of students who are kind of doing some really interesting, amazing work. So on the next, I think there's a follow-up. Yeah, so this is a little bit of my own work, where I'm mixing some portrait drawings that I've done over the past year with some other kind of digital design elements. And it's intentionally exploring some really subtle, like, urban design elements. And so I'm having some fun with that.
I'm sorry, I have to ask, because you mentioned it before you joined everybody. Those are marker?
The portraits are marker drawings, yes.
Fantastic.
Aren't they beautiful?
Yeah.
Oh my God, we're gonna have a separate conversation.
Okay. But in the book, one of my favorite kind of samples from the book is this illustration here. One thing that I think is really fascinating is the way that we're personally influenced from our environments. And even our socioeconomic status and upbringing. And so, for example, if you grew up, really well off, or in a, family that, where money was sort of normal, your design of a bank or a logo for a bank might be very corporate and sort of quiet. If you grew up like me and a lot of my students, and maybe the idea of wealth the idea of wealth might conjure up a completely different image, a completely different usage of color or texture. And so, depending on your relationship with these sort of concepts, your design will look different and reflect differently. And so I think that's really just fascinating. And so we try to illustrate it here in the book with these examples.
Thanks. So we're coming to a conclusion of showing these images. The book has, in addition to having 7 authors, dozens of contributors, amazing designers who contributed fonts and posters and interviews and essays and excerpts from published works. And these are just some of the amazing pieces in the book. So I encourage you to take a look and see more. And we are just so delighted to be here and to talk more about these ideas with you.
Ellen, thank you so much. I'm sure there's many, many questions by many, many people. And I wonder, I'm looking in the chat here, since we're such a small group, I'm going to let people ask them themselves. Who would like to go first? What questions do we have here?
Well, I see a really wonderful comment from Laura Hatcher. Hi,
Yes.
Laura, about being a full-time caregiver to her son. And working at home becoming an accessibility feature. I don't know, Laura, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. Simon's
Hi,
right here.
Laura, so great to see you.
It's good to see you. I'm so excited about this. I'm a teacher, I'm a graphic designer, and I'm also a disability
Micah
rights
alum.
advocate, a Micah alum. I'm one of Ellen's former students, which, so amazing. But, hang on a minute, Simon, mom's talking. The accessibility and can Simon say hi?
Of course,
Hi,
hi,
Simon.
Simon, it's great to see you.
We are hanging out. You just did, sweetheart. 1 second. Like I said,
It's real life, right?
It's, with, having the pandemic and him needing to be home more for online school, he's got complex medical needs. He just got his first vaccination on Sunday. So, we're trying to make all of these things work. The idea that telling people that I work from home is no longer stigmatizing, it doesn't feel unprofessional, it doesn't make people question the value of the work that I do anymore. I think that for me and for other caregivers, that's amazing. And then I work with so many people with disabilities in an advocacy space. They're welcome everywhere now. There's no question if they can show up to something. Even congressional meetings that we've had, now they're on Zoom. So we can have a family with, very disabled children in Arizona who have trouble traveling can meet with their senator in Washington, D.C. with no holds barred, even using communication devices. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that as we return to normal, remembering the importance of this accessibility and these multimodal approaches is incredibly important for folks like me and for my students and for, really everybody to participate on an equal playing field.
Yeah, whatever I think whatever we design next is going to have to include some of that access. And I've been reading a lot of this in the disability community about how suddenly museums have all these great, programs and features that people don't have to physically come to the museum. And disabled artists and members of the public are saying, why did you wait? We've always wanted to have that access in those programs. I see a really cool question from Nancy Collins. Hi, Nancy. Are the principles of design and the elements of design still viable, or are they irrelevant now? I mean, I have a thought about that, but then I want to have Kaleena answer too. But when I was looking at the beautiful symbols, the African symbols, when we put those illustrations in the book, it was like, well, this is how you teach symmetry, bilateral symmetry, asymmetry. radial symmetry, like all those ideas are in that series of symbols.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that's kind of spot on. I think it's recognizing that, for me anyway, there are other people who have, I think, some interesting kind of counterpoints about this, but my thoughts are that, the principles of design, they're supposed to serve in a really objective manner, right? In terms of just like the way that that we perceive images, right? So scale relationships are just that, balance is just that. And so I think that those are a really great starting point. That those are sort of the things that I go back to so that my students can rely on the kind of objective nature of design, and then sort of then have conversations about that subjectivity, separately, and so they can bring in some aesthetic things or some style choices that that might not fit sort of like mainstream, but it's still objectively sort of communicating what it needs to communicate. Does that, you know what I mean? It makes
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
absolutely.
And so I think that also what's important is like that we do expand our examples of what we use when we're teaching balance and we're teaching, contrast, and we're teaching all of these like really basic principles, and we're bringing in examples like the African Adinkra symbols and other designs. And we're not just relying on, again, those kind of those same examples that we typically see in our design history books. So.
I think it's also really important to, as we tell the history of, the Bauhaus and mainstream design,
Yeah,
to foreground the degree to which African art and Asian art are the basis of modern design. And that it was, European designers, going to the museum or the antique store and seeing those things help them to overthrow the rule of classical art. But then they acted like it was their discovery, right? Because they were white avant-garde designers, they had discovered something. So the way we tell that story is changing, and telling the story of the Bauhaus as embedded in a very rich cultural discussion, and not simply it was created from nothing.
yeah, and I think that there's still a ton of value in Western design. I never ever try to suggest that there isn't. And so when I teach, I still teach components of international typographic style and Bauhaus and all of that, but I just try to add context around those conversations. And so it's like if we're studying an example from a book that doesn't include other designs, then I just have a conversation about it, and I just say, well, there were people that were excluded, or there were other people doing the same work, and so I don't think that it means that we stop having any conversations. I think we just have more more conversations.
Stretching.
Yeah.
But stretching the canon does mean you're going to have to take out some things,
Yeah,
in order to teach. And that's
provide
something
balance.
that all of us teaching design history are working on doing.
Adrienne Shaughnessy wrote a beautiful essay last month on Design Observer about this subject, in which he interviewed some people involved in something called the Pan-African Design Institute. And Saki Mafundikwa, who some of you may know, had so much to say about what Ellen just said on the subject of the origin of form that comes from, talk about an expansive canon. This is, I think, a field day opportunity for educators everywhere to look for such rich sources and to hear people like Saki talk about it. Betsy, I couldn't find the link because I'm paying too much attention here. Could you just find that and link it in the chat? That'd be great. Yeah, a very important point and a great moment to be doing this.
I believe Silas Monroe is going to do his BIPOC design history course. Is going to have Saki. Yeah, there's a talk by him on Juneteenth. Yeah.
Oh, so wonderful, wonderful. We should link that too, Betsy. Thanks.
I see Steve Thomas has a very excellent, straightforward question. How long did it take to create the book? Well, about 2 years. And then there's like printing, there's like a delay while the book is being produced. So about 2 years.
But I have a quick follow-up question to that. And Steve, you may want to jump in here too. I don't mean to step on your wonderful question, but so much has happened in those 2 years.
I know.
So I was, and Emma Steinhobel commented on this earlier, I was very taken with what you did in this presentation, Ellen, which was sharing the story of the Indian goddess, how the elephant in the room became not a white man, but an elephant who was pink. I think it's so helpful to see the gestation of the ideas in such a turbulent 2-year period, but also the collaboration between you and Jennifer Tobias and your editors, your co-authors, as you try to wrestle to the ground these very difficult questions about how to talk about racism, about how to open up conversations, and about how to visualize what in our mind's eye these things need to be for others, which is the purpose of education.
What authorship needs to be.
Right. And what co-authorship.
So early in the book, Kaleena was a contributor to the book. And I had met her at AIGA Nashville and interviewed her for the book and was following the amazing things that she was doing on the AIGA website. But at a certain point, it was clear that she should be an author and we needed more authors. And that that this topic can't be told through 1 or 2 voices. And even though the book always had all these components and interviews and bits and pieces, and it was always this eclectic thing, it was really important to change that sense of authorship. And I'm sorry Josh isn't here, because Josh is an incredible writer and thinker and really brought the disability discourse of the book into the modern age. I mean, I could show you some original stuff I had, like a kind of checklist of how to create forms on the internet that are accessible. And it was just like exactly what isn't adequate, that this book needed to have a philosophical inquiry about design and disability, not a checklist of how to make sure your website, is communicating correctly.
I had a quick question. What is the total page count of the book? And
I like your questions, Steve. They're very easy to answer.
Well, the second one is better.
No, I like it. It's 220.
Okay.
That hit me.
And then is there anything interesting that you wish you could have included in the book that you didn't get a chance to?
Yes. Well, for example, I've learned so much from Kaleena after the book got published, like Afrocobra. She writes about it, but we should have a whole chapter on that. Silas Monroe and Tashika Arsenault Sutton did, a whole program on Black graphic design history that, upturned so much knowledge that I didn't know about, and it has been so exciting. But the thing is they'll write that book, and there will be more books, and there should be a book only about Black graphic design. Tashika is working on a book about Black women graphic designers. This is such important, amazing work, and it is being done, and it's really exciting to watch it happen and to support it in the background, like encouraging Cooper Hewitt to collect more Black graphic design so that then it can appear in those books, that other scholars will write.
One of the things I just want to briefly touch on today's episode of The Design of Business, we interviewed Melanie Keane, who's the director of Wellcome Institute in London. I don't know if we have anybody on today from London, one of the founders of the Black Lives Movement in the UK. And she talks about preparing for her job interview as director of the Wellcome by walking through the permanent exhibition and trying to situate herself in terms of what's comfortable for her and what's very uncomfortable for her. And I wonder if you could speak to that, either you or Kaleena, about really having to approach some material that was maybe discomforting. Maybe you disagreed with each other. Maybe you had to speak up about things. I mean, Ellen, you spoke so graciously about your form, your checklist not measuring up. But I mean, that really the humility that you need as a documentarian to be able to address these uncomfortable issues is, I think, a big piece of the story. Could you speak to sort of maybe what was hard about that? Or did you all agree going in that this was a battlefield you were going to go through together?
It's all uncomfortable. You know, I'm a white woman, right? You know, trying to write about inclusive design. And who am I to write about that or to teach about it? And yet I feel like it's the responsibility of all the white ladies and all the white men to not just sit by and say, well, this is the year I'm going to read about it, but to actually incorporate it in our teaching and our practice. And it's just been an honor that others joined in this project and contributed really authentic, original, grounded pieces that are grounded in experience of the design world.
Yeah, and if I can add to Ellen's credit, I think that, you know, the book certainly originated surrounding feminism, right? And so that was the original theme. And so I think that, you know, it speaks to the ability to just like listen and really hear what other people are saying and take in, you know, kind of what was going on in 2020 and all of the changes, you know, and all of the kind of like trauma of, you know, the racial trauma that was happening and kind of in society and recognizing that there needed to be a shift. And so no matter the amount of work that had previously gone into the book, that you guys were willing to stop and reassess and say, well, you know, well, wait, like, are we sharing enough, you know, narratives? Are we really, you know, being equitable, you know, in our conversation? And so bringing myself in and Josh and Leslie and, you know, all, and Farah and Valentine, you know, that really to me speaks to the idea that this whole book is about. You know, it's sharing narratives from people that you don't typically hear from, and again, just not just us, but all of the various contributors as well. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make sure to say I think this book sort of exemplifies it in a way in terms of like its journey that it's taken, you know, from its origins and to what it is today. What was the original title? It was the original title of the book.
Well, it was good. Oh, the original title was Ms. Helvetica, a feminist guide to graphic design. And I had been, you know, writing a kind of novel about a young woman named Miss Helvetica, and thank God that never came to life. But it was an experiment in whatever storytelling. But, you know, reading about the history of feminism, you realize that this was a white discourse that explicitly excluded women of color, that, you know, white feminists in the early 20th century felt that discussions of race were a distraction from the goal of suffrage for women. And it was very explicit. And at the same time, there were Black feminists who were saying, we are part of this conversation, and we have our own issues too. We have our own, you know, own things that we're trying to fight against. So learning about that was, you know, really, really important, and reading those writers.
We have a few minutes left. Anybody want to jump in? Maybe Marcus's son has a question. Is that a son?
It's a daughter.
It's a daughter. Does she have a question?
Hello.
She looks very intent.
Yeah, she is. We're discussing sharing confidence.
Oh, good.
Not
That's Miss Helvetica right there.
That's true. But it was actually really, really intriguing point how you came up with the term of confidence equity. How did you come up with it? I mean, it seems obvious when you hear it.
Well,
it wasn't there forever. So
there's a term quite common, in the study of confidence called the confidence gap, which looks at, why do women seem to have less confidence than men, and it just grew out of that. There's real research on this subject, but by using the term equity, it weaves into this broader discussion of equality versus equity and the importance of seeing this issue of the confidence gap as a social issue, not just as an individual, personal, failing of those who lack confidence.
I wonder, Jennifer Ekeleme, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, forgive me.
Ekeleme.
Ekeleme. You had a little comment you put in there that I think speaks to this. Do you want to say anything about these portfolio schools where most teachers are white?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation. I had actually messaged Kaleena not too long before this and realized that we both went to VCU Brand Center. And my own experience there was, it was wonderful, but at the same time, very, what's the correct word? It just was unsettling because I came with all of this cultural experience that I wanted to integrate into not only my strategy, but also talk to my art directors and my copywriters about how do we create these campaigns that are very compelling. And a lot of the feedback, obviously all of my teachers were white. And so anytime there were, really interesting cultural campaigns that we came up with, we ended up getting a lot of feedback that was almost like, oh, I don't understand this. This is, you get a lot of feedback as a person of color in advertising that oftentimes is coming from the perspective of the teacher. And so what ends up happening is you develop a little bit of an imposter syndrome around your ideas because the people who are trying to teach you don't have the range, right? Or they don't have that lived experience. And so you end up defaulting and acquiescing into mainstream development of ideas, right? Unless you work at some big brands like Nike who really pull from big cultural movements to create things that ultimately become really mainstream. So my comment was really more of just really a statement of why it's really important for people like Kaleena and others who are, really practiced and experts in their field to come back and teach, because there's a lot of young people of color who really would excel in this, right? In design and really applying design to all parts of our business and culture, but they don't see it, right? They don't see teachers who can actually, really recognize and say, oh, you really love all of this cultural stuff. Let me make sure that I'm teaching you the principles of design, but let you express it in a way that's really interesting to you, right? So I'm always an advocate of people who like Kaleena and others who are going back and teaching, because it's important for us to see it, because I didn't get it. Even though I went to a portfolio school, I had a lot of trouble trying to reconcile what was mainstream, what was my interest, and what I felt was really interesting culturally, right? But wasn't being recognized by my teachers who I trusted. So yeah. Thank you for asking.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that comment. I don't know that it required a follow-up, but I just wanted to say I had a very similar experience. And one thing I'll say really quickly is that I do sometimes consider, I think about the experiences of my students and sort of just even the value of the representation, of just, me being there in that position for them, in that relationship with them. And so even on hard days, it's like, remembering that, I'm representing something valuable just by being a Black woman teaching design in this industry. And I think too, to your point about other people maybe not understanding certain concepts or directions that you're wanting to take, sometimes it's very like, overt, like criticism. And it's like, I don't like that idea, let's go in different directions. And sometimes it's just being ignored or having an idea just not really getting a response, or a full response, where you see that other people are getting a fuller discussion or response, and there's more time being taken that validate, sort of other points of view. And so I think that's something we can all be conscious of, not just as educators, but also as peers, and when we recognize that that's happening, and sort of taking space to recognize other people's, contributions, particularly if it's from someone that's in a minority group, if it's a woman or, or something like that. And, that pink elephant is sort of taking over the conversation. So yeah, but anyway, I appreciate you being here and your comments.
Yeah, and as a faculty member, like if I don't understand something, it should be then my job to try to understand it, not to say, oh, you should make things that are understandable to me. And I feel that's just the way design, has always been taught, as a kind of unlearning of, you can't make manga and comic books anymore. You have to like put aside childish things and learn about the grid, which I love the grid and I love flush left. But this is a reckoning of what does loving that prevent me from seeing? And what do I need to learn and listen to differently?
So that's the title for your new book, Flush Left, The Reckoning. I would read that. Starring Miss Helvetica. We just have a few minutes left, and our little Emma Steinhobel, our favorite student, who has come to every single one of these events, so she always gets a shout out.
Emma.
Kind of like on NPR when he talks about BJ Liederman wrote our theme music. I always mention Emma. She's stirring the pot a little bit with this question, but I wonder if you could just address it. Obviously, the first big masterclass was happened recently with David Carson as the chosen, anointed, come to Jesus person meant to teach design to the multitudes. And I wonder if you want to take this question before we end our conversation today, Ellen or Kaleena. Who would you choose?
Yes, I saw the question. Who would you choose?
Would you choose Kaleena and Jennifer together to teach that class? That's my vote. Go on, over to you, Ellen.
Well, I guess I would start with the whole question of the master. Like, are we still using this word in 2021? It is so freighted with the sins of this country and the notion of mastery. And I just think it's just very problematic. And I think, that's my comment.
I think that's an exquisite response to actually, this is challenging the brief, challenge the frame.
Yeah.
Kaleena.
Say Adams is a Black visual artist, designer, who I think has done some amazing work and has an incredible history in the industry, but he's not well known. I'm going to put his name in the, it's C-A-Y. Oh, autocorrect wants to keep
Right.
That's a master problem right there.
There we go. Yeah, I would, that's who I would want to learn from.
Emory Douglas.
Yeah.
Clearly a master.
Yeah.
Right. The notion of master is someone mature in their career and a leader.
And I love David Carson's work. But if we're expanding the theme of expanding, I think there's lots of people, so hopefully we get more designers during those classes.
Beautiful. And we have to have more conversations like this one, which has been really a privilege and fun.
You made it so fun, Jessica.
It's so
Betsy,
fun. We
you.
love doing these lunchtime things. So thank you for sharing an hour of your day with us. And please write to us at Design Observer and let us know who you want to hear next. And we're all about books. So go to your local bookstore and buy this wonderful book. Can you hold it up, somebody? You have it there? Hold it up. You see the
Always
great
by
cover?
my side.
There's the pink.
Beautiful
the
cover
pink
by
elephant.
Shivani Parasnas.
Oh, look at that. Thank you,
graduate student
Trevor.
of mine.
Lovely. See, you have fans all over the world. Trevor in
Thank you.
Seattle has your book already. Oh, you are in Seattle, right? Did I get that right? You are. Okay, good. Good. Okay, everybody. Be well.
Thank
We'll see you
you,
next
thank
month.
you.
Thanks again.
guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.